Hi, I'm Sheila Kuehl, your erstwhile host for Get Used to It. And today, once again, we're going to revisit this Hawaii case because I know how fascinated not only our community, but given my experience in the state legislature, just about the whole world is about the prospect that same-gender couples just might be able to marry legally. Since we last talked about this case, we've had a decision from the lower court, as I'm sure the whole world now knows, indicating that the state did not have a very good reason to deny marriage licenses, and that's why we're here to talk today about that decision, about the kind of evidence and the issues that were presented by the state, and to talk a little bit about what the state of Hawaii is like before the million of you out there decide you're going to move there tomorrow and get married. So let me introduce you to our guests today. Professor Chris Littleton, who is a professor of law and women's studies at UCLA and the former president of the board of the California Women's Law Center. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, great to be here.
Good that you're here. Dr. Deborah Stewart, who is a, professor of pediatric and adolescent medicine at the College of Medicine at UC Irvine, and also president of the Orange County Pediatric Society, although I know it has another name, right?
That's right. Thanks a lot.
Well, very glad you're here. Thank you for being here. We're doing pretty well so far. And our last guest, Charlie Makinney, who is actually the city manager of the city of West Hollywood, who grew up in Hawaii and is our resident expert on Hawaii here. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you.
Glad you're all here. Let's start with you, Chris. Tell us a little bit about how this case was really set, sort of the legal theory, and how the state of Hawaii did in the trial court.
This case is so much fun to talk about. Actually, I have to tell you a little personal story. When I went to law school, we had a moot court competition, and our case was whether a same-sex couple could collect in a wrongful death action. And we researched, of course, everywhere and could not find one place where a same-sex couple was allowed to do anything that other people. And this was in 1981. And so even then, there were all of these challenges to marriage laws that reserved marriage for two-sex couples, for a man and a woman. And all of them failed. And we couldn't figure out why, because logically, they should have been no-brainers. Right? Logically, if any state law treats differently someone because they're male or because they're female, that law has to meet an incredibly high burden to be constitutional. Under the federal constitution, it has to be, the distinction that the government makes has to be substantially related to an important governmental interest, or else it's gone. And under state law, the burden is frequently even higher. California and Hawaii both use the highest level of scrutiny for sex discrimination. You can't have a difference in treatment by the state based on your sex unless the government has a compelling reason and unless the distinction is necessary. So if it's narrowly tailored. Now, who would ever think that it was necessary to say to me, if you want to get married, you cannot marry the person you love because of her sex. Or you cannot marry the person you love because of your sex.
Now, those would really be two different things, though, wouldn't they? I mean, one of the things that's interesting is if it's about the gender of the person you want to marry, and you're the plaintiff, then you're really talking about sexual orientation, right? Your sexual orientation. But wasn't it different in terms of the way it came to the court in Hawaii? I mean, what you've said about gender discrimination, thanks to all those cases in the 70s that Ruth Bader Ginsburg brought to the Supreme Court, bless her heart, we have a very high standard. I mean, I think this notion of level of scrutiny, when we talk about it, people picture, you know, I don't know exactly what that means, but when you go in and you sue the state because you can't get married, if it's sex discrimination or any race discrimination, the state has to put on their case, and they have to say, okay, this is why we're doing it, and that's what you were indicating is there a compelling reason?
I mean, one thing to remember is that it wasn't until 1971 that the U.S. Supreme Court, for the first time, struck down a state law or any law on the basis that discriminated on the basis of sex, that it was sex discrimination. So it took a long time. I mean, they had been striking down laws for race discrimination for a long time before they finally got around to sex discrimination. Of course, it took them 100 years to start on race discrimination, but that's another story. So that it takes a while for the logic of these things to work their way through the courts, even though it's fairly elementary logic. I mean, we're not talking a really hard question here. The issue is, okay, I'm standing in front of you, and you say to me, I'm sorry, if you were a man, we would give you a license to marry her. Mm-hmm. But since you're a woman, we will not give you a license. Mm-hmm. Now, on what basis are you discriminating against me? You haven't even asked me what my sexual orientation is. You don't know. I haven't told you. Don't ask, don't tell. I say nothing. All I say is, we want to get married. And they say, if you were a man, sure. Since you're a woman, forget it. Now, that's straight up sex discrimination, but all through the 1970s, all through the 1980s, couple after couple argued that, and the courts would say, we understand what you're saying, but this is not sex discrimination. And you say, why not? Because marriage by definition means a man and a woman. You say, yes, so who made up that definition? Oh, well, the state did, because it's a matter of state law. Yeah, isn't that definition unconstitutional? Next case, please. I mean, that's exactly how those cases read. They read, here they claim sex discrimination, but this is really just a definitional problem. As if the state doesn't define marriage. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, in the 1990s, what has made a huge splash, so to speak, in the late 80s and the 90s, were attempts to use the Constitution on behalf of gay people, gay men, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgendered people, by making claims that we were being discriminated against on the basis of sexual orientation. Now, no court, well, actually, for a short period of time, some courts in California did, treat that as a kind of discrimination that was so dangerous to engage in that the state would have to have a really good reason. In fact, under the most law, all the state needs is a rational reason. Anything that could possibly make sense will allow you to allow the state or the government government agency to discriminate against you on the basis of your sexual orientation.
Just like if it was blue eyes or the color of your hair or something that they don't find is a dangerous form of discrimination.
Right.
Although in the case of our community, it's not that no one thought it was dangerous, it's that everyone thought it was just fine, even though it was dangerous to us.
Right. That the majority did not see it, the heterosexual majority did not see this as something that they needed to change. Right? They thought that it was natural to treat gay people worse, and that was okay. But since 1971, nobody has been willing to say it's okay to treat people worse because of their sex. And since the mid-1800s, it has been gradually less and less okay to treat people badly because of their race. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about the classification, it makes a big difference. How much do you have to establish? So the state, this case is amazing because for the first time, a court actually followed the logic of sex discrimination and said, this isn't just about sexual orientation. This isn't just straight couples versus gay couples. This really is. You, Sheila, if you were a man, we would let you marry her. But since you're a woman, we won't. Oh yeah, we get it. It's sex discrimination. So therefore, the state has to prove that in Hawaii, it has a compelling reason, and that reason can't be done by any other way. So what do they offer as their compelling reasons? They have to think really hard, right? The state has a compelling interest in protecting the health and welfare of children. Yeah, so. The state has a compelling interest in fostering procreation. Yeah, so. I mean, it's as if we're all sterile. The state has a compelling interest in securing or assuring recognition of Hawaii marriages in other jurisdictions. Now, since when has a state ever allowed some other jurisdiction to tell them what their law can be? And they have an interest in protecting the public fisc. Because why? It would cost some money to give marital benefits to anybody who wants to get married. Now, of course, every time some straight couple walks up to the altar or walks up to the office and takes a marriage license, what happens? It costs the state money, right? Do they ever complain about that? Mm-mm.
No, as a matter of fact, they said one of their major reasons is to encourage people to get married.
Right.
Just not us.
Right. You want to encourage people to get married, but not other people, and you claim money reasons, so that didn't make any sense. The one thing that really came down to was the effect on children. Children raised in families. And so the state put on experts, because this was the one reason that wasn't laughed out of court early on. And they looked and looked for experts to figure out, to tell the court, here we are at trial, and we have to prove this, so we got to find an expert to testify that same-sex couples are bad for children. So what do? They call up a bunch of experts, and of course all the experts say, no, that's not true. All the studies indicate that there's not really much of a problem. So finally they come up with 4 people they're going to put on the stand, right? One of them says that the studies that show that same-sex couples are good parents or okay parents are flawed. They have real problems in the methodology. Then, of course, on the stand as they're questioning this person, he says, well, you know, all those psychological studies are flawed and all the sociology studies are flawed, and in fact, you can never prove anything with one of these studies. And as a matter of fact, he said, you know, there's not even any real proof that evolution occurred.
Their witness said this?
Their witness, the state's witness. So the judge...
Well, that's like a lawyer's dream on the other side.
Yeah. Hey!
You go, see this guy self-destruct on the stand.
Well, in fact, I mean, that was the great thing about this, was the case was proved, the case for the plaintiffs was proved by the defendant's experts. The other thing they used was a chart that Pepper Schwartz had developed, when was it? In the 1970s, about how long couples stayed together, right? And they found that, in fact, married couples stayed together longer than anybody else, longer than unmarried heterosexuals, longer than lesbians, longer than gay men. And so this was their big evidence, right? Hey, married heterosexual couples stay together longer, so that's better for the kids, right? Now, this was done in the 1970s. The latest thing in it is like 1981. And so they present this as one of their key features in their argument. Well, guess who decides to testify for the plaintiffs? Pepper Schwartz, the author of the book. Right? The person who did the study says, hey, I did that study in the 70s. Things have changed radically since then. And besides which, you know, we couldn't ask whether married gay or lesbian couples stayed together longer.
Because none of them could get married.
Right, because you wouldn't let us get married.
Well, it sounds as though, I mean, there was a lot of rejoicing when this decision came out, and a lot of speculation about what it could mean. But I wanted to ask you, Deborah, talk a little bit more about these studies as a pediatrician, as a professor of pediatric medicine, and I know with a specialty in adolescent medicine as well. Your own reading on what might have been presented. Did the state just blow it and there's all these studies out there showing that our same-sex couples really are bad for kids, or is this really what the evidence shows and your own experience?
Actually, what Chris said was true. When the defendants were questioned about the literature, every defendant agreed that there were no studies showing that gay or lesbian parents, the children of gay and lesbian parents, actually fared any differently than the children of heterosexual parents. In fact, every witness for the defense said that gays and lesbians could do adequate, if not very good parenting, equal to that of heterosexual single people or coupled people. So there was never any information and not one single study that was really put forward to really say that gay or lesbians could not be good parents.
Now, is this a well-studied area now?
Dr. Charlotte Patterson probably put together the largest number of studies in a recent monograph that she put together for the American Psychological Association. In that, she cites over 125 studies and book chapters and articles that based on this. Studies have been done on this field since about 1978 and up. So about the last 18, 20 years, people have really looked at whether or not gays and lesbians can make good parents. The reason, though, that this has been looked at is because of custody issues. Whether or not a gay or lesbian parent should have custody, primary custody of a child versus the other, perhaps heterosexual parent. And no one's really studied, because we can't, because there's no marriage, what the effects of gays and lesbians actually marrying together are, on kids' welfare. What we do have is studies that show the effects of particularly lesbians coupling on the welfare of kids. So Charlotte Patterson really reviewed this for the psychologists, and she looked at a number of different areas, and her viewpoint was really guided by what kinds of things the court tended to look at when trying to decide whether or not to give custody to gay or lesbian parents. And one of the first things, of course, the court looked at was whether or not the children's gender role, gender identity, sexual orientation were affected by their parents' homosexuality, i.e., were their parents' homosexuality, was that an infectious disease that they could pass on, to the child?
Well, and also, not only were they going to be gay themselves, but I think there's probably even more concern about gender identity, because you always hear about, well, there's no man in the house. How is that boy going to know how to act? And of course, since so many men are sort of rejecting this overt masculinity,
right.
We make war, we beat up women kind of image anyway, that I guess they're saying maybe it's better if he, if he gets a little mitigation. But this notion of gender identity too, I think, is a major concern.
There's only the other issue, before I kind of talk more about that gender identity issue, was the classic issue as if children were in families headed by gay and lesbian folks, were they more likely to be sexually abused? That's the big, issue that gets brought forward to the courts. That's unsaid, but really is part of people's thoughts when they make decisions. The notion that there might be differences in gender identity and gender role of kids has been studied by at least 15 investigators throughout since 1978 all the way to 1994, and have looked at single lesbian parents, some single and couple lesbian parents, some gay fathers, and also kids born by donor insemination. So there's all kinds of studies. One study looks at people from 10 states and all kinds of socioeconomic levels. So it really looks at this. So the first thing people looked at was there any difference in actual gender identity? And they looked at, for example, what gender a child draws when they're asked to draw themselves, how children dress, whether they dress in gender appropriate types of clothing and not clothing, and how they self-identify. And they found no differences, really no differences in kids' gender identity from what their biologic gender actually was. More interesting, I think, is the gender role stuff. People looked at both grade school kids and adolescents, and did a number of studies on gender role. There's a study called I think it's the BEM gender role study, where they looked at adolescents and found that looking at masculinity and androgyny in children of lesbian parents versus children of heterosexual parents, there was no difference. But that daughters of lesbian parents had greater psychologic femininity than daughters of heterosexual parents. Oops. Oops. No. None of these studies.
Hey, kids always have to rebel a little bit.
That's what I mean. Maybe. We have a professor of adolescent medicine who's going to say maybe
right, and that may be exactly right. Also, when they looked at other ways to measure gender roles, is what kids play with, who kids identify as their favorite TV character, and those kinds of things. There were no real differences differences in what kids thought about their own gender role in society and who they played with and who they identified with. But there was some interesting differences again in children of lesbians versus children of heterosexual women. And they found that children of lesbians were more likely to play with trucks and children of heterosexual women were more likely to play with guns in one study, which I thought was very interesting. There wasn't a whole lot of comment on that study, but it was kind of interesting. And that as far as dress, this is a study from the late 70s. Children of lesbian parents, daughters of lesbian parents, were more likely to dress in boys' clothes or pants. And at that time, at least the authors said that their mothers tended to dress in slacks, and they thought that was really a function more of what their parents dressed as, rather than that did not reflect gender role at all.
Let me get this right. So children of heterosexual mothers, their kids like to play with guns most.
In one study.
In this one study,
Right.
and the children of lesbian mothers, they like most to play with trucks. Now, what would you like your kids to play with, trucks or guns?
Now,
If that's the choice.
excuse me, Professor, we're not judging these studies.
Yeah, excuse
I mean, the thing is, I'm really enjoying it too. But in a way, there's an undertone of tragedy in having to talk about these issues in court as a way of saying, you know, we're not bad for children, because that's the mythology, and of course it's a very powerful mythology. Not only the notion, which you haven't talked about yet, about sexual abuse, which is a deep mythology that we easily refute by looking at how many people who are straight are actually accused of and convicted of child sexual abuse, as opposed to anyone from our community who would be, I think, looked at pretty carefully. But also just the notion that gender roles are such an important part of a child's development. Not gender identity, which I think you appropriately distinguish, but whether girls play with dolls is so important that we must talk about whether, if they don't play with dolls, this is a dangerous thing for society, a bad thing for them. I mean, the power of it.
I'm happy to know that at least in these several studies that they did measure children playing with dolls and daughters playing with dolls, and girls of heterosexual parents and of lesbian parents played with dolls equal percentage of time. That wasn't the differentiating factor.
So I can see why the state had a really uphill battle on this. You know, I mean, they must have thought of the reason that was going to be compelling before they explored whether anyone was going to testify. Not only was it not a compelling reason in and of itself had it been proven, but then they could not even prove it, which is another step. Not to mention the fact that we weren't talking about whether children should be raised by same-sex couples, but whether those couples who are already raising children should be able to marry.
Right.
Which is completely makes the whole notion of it irrelevant.
Because all of the defense, all of the state's experts testify that, of course, same-sex people and couples should be allowed to adopt, right?
Yes.
So,
Yes.
So yeah, we should have kids, but we shouldn't get married.
Well, studies is interesting. The studies of the donor insemination studies that have been done by Dr. Patterson in the California Sperm Bank graduates, I guess you call them. I don't know. Children, both of heterosexual parents and of gay and lesbian parents born through sperm donation, found that it didn't make any difference as far as the children's psychological development and adjustment, whether the parents were heterosexual or homosexual, but it made a big difference in the support systems that the parents had for each other and the relationship of nurturing that the child had with the adult, and it really had nothing to do with the gender of the parents. So that's really an interesting and some really new data.
Now, what is your own experience with any of the children with whom you've worked or who have been your patients?
I'm a teenage medicine specialist, so at the university there aren't too many of us, so I tend to see most of particularly of the faculty's children, and I've had a number of children adolescents brought to me, who've been in the middle of a crisis about their parents' sexual orientation. And my experience is what you would predict is early and middle adolescents who are very, very, very hooked into peers and being exactly like the norm, like if everybody else's family drives a Toyota Camry, you know, it's death if you drive a Datsun, you know, that kind of stuff. Middle and early adolescents really do have more symptoms of stress related to their parents' sexual orientation. And that's also was one of the witnesses for the plaintiffs. Dr. Bob Bidwell, who is an adolescent medicine specialist at University of Hawaii, also stated that. And that's also been shown in the literature, that early and middle adolescence is probably not the greatest time to kind of say, hey, guess what? This roommate I have is, but what Dr. Bidwell found, and what I've also found, is that when these early and middle adolescents grow up, get into late adolescence, which is the stage of individuation and maturation and understanding that you don't have to be exactly the cookie cutter of your best friend and that you're still okay, that the kids who experience the stresses of being different in early and middle adolescence, the stresses being due to their parents being gay, lesbian, actually have a more robust sense of self and a better comfort with diversity in their community. And so it's my experience, and also Dr. Bidwell's experience at the University of Hawaii, that these kids are really better off for having gone through the stress. It's kind of like, in order to build muscles, you know, you got to pump iron. It's the same kind of thing. You got to stressing these kids is a stress, but it actually ends up in making more robust kids in that way. So,
well, it was interesting to me when my niece, at the age of about 11 or 12, just finally understood that I was a lesbian. I mean, she'd known, but it hadn't meant anything until she started to have to deal with her own sexuality. She was very, very upset. And a couple of years later, when I got to talk to her about it, and to her mom, the reason had less to do with finding my sexual orientation distasteful, as that she was just beginning to deal with the fact that all the boys she liked so much as friends were now somehow changing in their roles. They were going to be threatening, or friendship wouldn't be the same. It was very stressful to her. And now it looked like all her friends were going to be potential sexual partners, and therefore there wouldn't be any real friends, you know, that you could just be friends with. And it was very interesting to me, because it hadn't even occurred to me that the whole thing was kind of about her own loss of this non-sexual life that kids allegedly should be able to live for a while. And that was sort of an additional stressful thing that really didn't have anything to do with what society thought.
Right.
So much as it had to do with everyone was at risk now, you know, in your friendship base.
And isn't it interesting that, I mean, you can see in a purer fashion there what a lot of feminists have been saying for years, which is it is a problem in our society that, in fact, sex isn't safe. The dominant message of sex is that that you will be unsafe, psychologically at least, and probably physically, with someone who's attracted to you. And in heterosexual marriages, we know that, you know, as many as 50% of them are marred by violence and by battering.
Of course, we have that in our community too. I mean, we've had a...
We just don't know about it.
Coming out of the closet about that has been an important part too.
Yeah, I think so, and I think we'll find that it is, you know, it is about power in sexual relationships more than the gender of the parties or the sexual orientation of the parties involved. It's about a system of dominance and subordination that really creates the underlying problem here, and not sexual orientation.
Well, Charlie, let me ask you. We've talked a lot, and everybody, of course, is talking about Hawaii. And now when they talk about Hawaii, they're not just talking about Waikiki and, you know, and all of the lovely islands, because they are. But when people say Hawaii, it's generally in the context of the Hawaii case. And that means, you know, gay marriage, not just in our community, but everywhere. And I know you grew up in Hawaii, and there's this mythology of, well, of course it's happening in Hawaii. They're so tolerant, so diverse. What is Hawaii really like?
Well, Hawaii is tolerant and it is diverse, and I think they take great pride in the melting pot concept, that, and so many of the families there are the product of mixed marriages, and it's hard to dislike a particular race when your daughter-in-law is of that race or your grandchildren of that race. It just becomes a matter of practicality that you just can't be a racist in Hawaii. But, you know, I don't think that really extends to the sexual orientation issue. But I need to preface that by saying the Native Hawaiian culture has always been very open and accepting of gay and lesbian people, particularly in the family setting. But it was something that's just not discussed in polite company. I mean, you knew that Aunt Marjorie over here was a lesbian, and she had a partner that she had lived with for 25 years, but you just never discussed what sort of a sexual relationship that they had. You just accepted them, and they came to all the family gatherings and that kind of thing. But I think the other aspect of it is, although people there are very accepting of one another's ethnic and cultural differences, there's also a feeling that, or an unwritten rule, that you don't intrude on their particular beliefs and value sets and that kind of thing. So if you have a Hawaiian friend who wants to give deference and respect to some of the old Hawaiian religious practices, or to the Ali's, the old royal family, you accept that and you let them do that. You don't tell them that that's wrong, or you know, intrude on that kind of thing. And unfortunately, I think that unwritten rule kind of extends, or is coming out in this sexual orientation thing, that a lot of people unfortunately look at same-gender marriages as kind of an intrusion on their personal values and customs, and they're having a lot of trouble dealing with that. And I think that's why you see the polls over there where majority of the residents oppose same-gender marriages. You see traditionally very liberal, socially progressive legislators vigorously opposing same-gender marriage, and it's a very complex issue.
So it really isn't that different. I mean, this could have, in your opinion, this could have happened in
Anywhere.
Massachusetts or another place that would be considered a liberal state. I mean,
Right.
Hawaii is not in any way an ultra-conservative militia
No.
hangout.
And I think this case is kind of a logical outcome to the kind of a populist, progressive, liberal political structure or political orientation that came out maybe 40, 50 years ago and has been emerging ever since, that it is a very liberal state, it is very socially progressive. And then the other factor is that we talked about earlier before the show started, was the fact that the judges there are appointed, they're not elected. So they don't have to stand for election. And I think they're a little bit braver to make constitutionally sound decisions that may be unpopular in the community. And I think that has a lot to do with the success of the same-gender case in Hawaii.
Yeah, because we've seen that the legislators, or at least some of them, have been trying to figure out what they can do to keep this from happening.
Right. Right.
Now, there may be some concern that that the state will turn out suddenly, because of this, to be a grand gay mecca, you know, and that it will be like San Francisco, so that I can see, although the tourism business would pick up enormously among our community, that if it was seen as a place where lots and lots of gay people went, that it could then be a problem for the tourism business, for, you know, straight people that didn't want to be in a state where everywhere they went, you know, there were male or female couples holding hands and sort of doing what the straight couples do in Hawaii. It's an enormously romantic setting, because a lot of our community do go to Hawaii, but we are not, I think, overt in public about, even about holding hands or being affectionate.
You know, that's what I was very interested by what you said about the question about intrusion and whether sort of a public recognition of something affects other people's values. I mean, we never think when a heterosexual person wears a wedding ring that they are flaunting their heterosexuality.
Right.
But in fact, that's exactly what's happening. And yet, you know, when a same-sex couple simply hold hands, we accuse them of flaunting it. And it originally, in the Hawaii case, what the state argued was that that granting marriage licenses to same-sex couples would undermine the family structure of, and the importance of family structure of traditional heterosexual marriages. They didn't push that at the trial level because while it may be affecting people's sort of prejudices and assumptions, there is absolutely no evidence. I have to, I mean, at the risk, my background is English, so I hope I'll be able to make a joke against my forebearers, which is the joke that saying that heterosexual marriage or homosexual gay marriage would undermine straight couples is sort of like blaming the French for the way English food tastes. Right?
Well, but you hear that argument all the time, as though, and it makes a lot of sense to me because discrimination in and of itself really only makes sense in terms of creating a hierarchy of better and worse, where the better people get something that the worse people don't get. It could be, I mean, there was a wonderful Star Trek episode that I remember with Frank Gorshin. I'll never forget the show. I don't think I've seen the rerun for years, where he came from a race of people that were all white on one side and all black on the other side. And he was chasing a fugitive who was also all white on one side and all black on the other side, but they were reversed, to bring him back to their world for justice. And of course, Captain Kirk, in his own way, said, "Now, could you explain to me? I mean, I see you're both, black and white." And Frank Gorshin's character was outraged that the captain could not comprehend instantly by seeing, and said, "Well, don't you understand? He's white on the right side." As though with that goes all the mythology that they had created about how stupid they are and how they're criminals and they're lazy and how you can't trust them near children. And of course, this is what I loved about Star Trek, is it always made these points very, like, let's hit you over the head with this point. But when you think about, this is what I love about science fiction too, is when you think about it, that's exactly what discrimination is for. They are really having a tough time in Hawaii. And all the other states really saying anything that makes real sense unless you're prejudiced. I mean, and the case that was just decided by the Supreme Court essentially took a big step and said prejudice is insufficient as a reason to distinguish, on the basis of sexual orientation. It's not even reasonable.
Right,
which you said was the lowest standard.
Evans, right.
Yeah.
And the Colorado Initiative case, where the U.S. Supreme Court said, you cannot separate out a group of people and say, you folks are second-class citizens on the basis of prejudice. You have to have some reason for separating out people and for treating them worse. Any reason will do when it comes to sexual orientation, but you have to have a reason, and prejudice is not a reason. And, it's interesting because throughout our constitutional history, we've had these moments where a court somewhere has recognized that prejudice, no matter how common, is not sufficient to uphold discrimination. I mean, Loving versus Virginia, in which Virginia had a statute that barred interracial marriage. And they said that's not race discrimination because, a black person can't marry a white person and a white person can't marry a black person, so we're treating white and black people the same. And the Supreme Court finally said, I think it was in the 1960s, no, even though it looks like you're not discriminating, you are upholding white supremacy. Because why else are you worried about this?
Rich and poor alike may sleep beneath the bridges of Paris. Right. I mean, that was the same notion.
But we have
Let them eat cake.
Right.
It was exactly the same, that to recognize. And the other thing that's wonderful for me is that people it's almost like they're holding their breath to have a court say something that is true about it.
He's like, oh yeah, of course.
Like the emperor has no clothes. Don't you know that there were 1,000 people thinking the emperor has no clothes? Why doesn't somebody say so? Before that little girl, I always thought it was a little girl.
Of course you did.
Right. Deborah, let me ask you though, in your own experience and from the literature, whatever, wherever you would form your opinion on this, Do you think it would be beneficial to the children of gay and lesbian couples if those couples could marry?
Oh, absolutely.
Why?
Because kids always do better. I mean, it's my experience. It's people who marry's experience. People who don't marry. When there is stability, why do people marry? For children, for economic stability, so that they can demonstrate intimacy and caring, so that they're more than one person to take care of a child, which makes a big difference. And all the reasons people marry for children heterosexually would really be exactly the same for same-sex couples. There would certainly be a lot more economic stability. Certainly children and really all the economic protections that the states do give, the children would be much better that way. But I think more importantly, the sense of that they have a full set of parents, even though they may be slightly different, really would make a child feel more comfortable and really clearly have a better self-esteem than what goes along with really single parenting.
Well, you know, go ahead, Chris.
Do you know what I worry about, though, is that, I mean, it's clear, I've done some work in the custody area on sex discrimination, and it's really clear that stability is good for kids. And yet, if the only way that you can achieve stability is through a state-sponsored marriage, what does that send? Now, if we finally come to the period where the state doesn't discriminate between same-sex and other-sex marriages, now is it going to move to discriminating between those who marry and those who don't?
Well,
and are
but
we going to have
already-
another hierarchy?
But it already discriminates, in a sense, let's say distinguishes
Enormously.
between those who marry and those who don't. And let me
Absolutely.
suggest, you and I have both taught contracts. Isn't that really what it's about? I mean, you make a promise, and you could keep it or not. I mean, there's no enforceability of any promises that we make to each other. We know that in our community, and straight people know it in their community. I mean, we say, I'll stay with you forever. And it's not enforceable. And there's no real punishment out there in the world. However, if you say, I will enter into a legal contract with you, and we will sign it, and the state will enforce it, because it's the kind of contract, not only in marriage does the state enforce the contract, they create the terms of the contract. Community property, a step-parent adoption instead of a stranger adoption or whatever. We would be allowing children to have two legal mothers, which we really don't allow, or two legal fathers, which we don't allow now. There would be terms of the contract. That's really, it's not, I don't think, that the state is only sanctioning it. It's also enforcing it. Because then when you divorce, there are lots of things that come into play because you've been married. Where if you didn't marry and you just break up, straight or gay, you don't get that.
I think the legitimization of the contract by the state would be a really important message, especially for the kids we talked about, the real vulnerable kids, the early and middle adolescents who are always kind of looking for external legitimization. I think that's a real strength of that, as opposed to when the relationship legally is not legitimate. And I think that really stresses kids, as we've already talked about. And so I think that would be another reason that the legitimization of marriage by the state would really make things better for kids whose parents are in a same-sex relationship already.
But let me go one step further, because if the state really cared about children, it would, rather than trying to keep some people from marrying, what it would be doing is providing the resources necessary to people who already are taking care of children. And those people are overwhelmingly women, straight and lesbian, who are taking care of children without the adequate resources to do so. They are denied all sorts of benefits that they would have if they were married, and they're divorced, or they're abandoned, or they never got married. And if it really cared about the kids, it would say, we don't care whether you are married or not. We're going to make sure you have the resources to take care of your child. And we could provide all of that very easily if we provided it to children.
So you're not a big fan of welfare reform, I take it.
I am a very big fan of welfare reform, but not the way they're doing it now.
Yeah,
Let's go in the other direction.
Well, but I wanted to ask, I'm sorry, were you
Go ahead.
I wanted to ask you, Charlie, because I don't really know exactly where this might be going, but my impression, just having been in Hawaii a bunch of times and actually getting to visit people who live there. I actually met every judge in Hawaii about 4 years ago because I went there to train the judges who were mandated to be trained on domestic violence. And Sarah Buell from Massachusetts and I, Buell and Kuehl, got to do this training. And I was struck by the diversity of the bench in Hawaii. Do you think that makes a difference in not just the fact that they're not elected, but in the way the judges themselves might perhaps have experienced or have some familiarity with discrimination and feel differently about it?
I'm sure that has a lot to do with it. You know, they're much more sensitive to the issue of discrimination. And I think a point came up earlier. I think if this is going to work, Hawaii is a place where it'll work the best, or because I think you have a sense of a general acceptance of gay and lesbian people to begin with. Well, there's discrimination and there's intolerance, you know, in the state as everywhere, but generally they're accepted. What I have found in talking to people is people don't understand why gay and lesbian people need this. You know, the reaction to me is, they can go ahead and live with whoever they want, but why do they need this? Why are they causing such a big problem over this thing? You know, it's nothing that we should be concerned with. And I think if more people understand what we're talking about of the benefits that gay and lesbian people are deprived of by not having the benefit of a marriage, in terms of inheritance and probate and taxes and, you know, all that kind of stuff. I think people will understand it, and the acceptance will grow for this kind of thing.
And this impact on the children that you were talking about too, Deborah. I mean, are your parents married or not?
Right.
With straight parents, it's an issue. They don't even know why it's an issue, but they know that there's a hierarchy of goodness in there. And
That's right.
And really, the other thing is, putting aside the benefits of it, if perhaps if people remember that Asian people were not allowed to marry white people here in California all the way up into the 50s. And that you would say, well, who needs it? You can always live together. The notion that you're denied something that someone else has on the basis of some trait or some life issue, it should be intrinsically unfair. The other thing I wanted to ask you is about this extended family. Because I also, like in many places where a lot of different ethnicities live together, we see a lot of extended families. The nuclear family was not the basis necessarily of family, at least as I saw it in Hawaii. And I wonder if that might also make a difference.
Absolutely, absolutely. A lot of people talk about family values, but it's generally when they speak of family values, they speak of families as they define it. Their extended family is very important, and it's both a Polynesian cultural thing and it's an Asian thing, where all the aunts and uncles take responsibility for the nurturing and the raising of the kids in the family, and it's very important.
You know, another interesting thing about extended families in a completely different context, but I think it supports this, is that when you look at outcomes of teen pregnancies, looking both at, you know, whether or not the teen goes back to school, goes on welfare, and all the usual things that we measure, but also how well the child does, how well the child does in school. In cultures where there is an extended family support, teens and their babies do much, much better than in cultures where there's not. And so where that's been studied in California is looking at children have Hispanic parents, young Hispanic parents, 13 and 14 and 15-year-olds, young Hispanic parents, versus children of Black and Caucasian parents, where the kids and the adolescents of their Hispanic origin just do a whole lot better. I mean, they adjust better. They go back to school. They have less truancy, less drug abuse, and their children do better. And that's, you know, again, that's I think an argument in a completely different sphere, but really adds credence to the argument about the importance of extended families.
Support matters.
Yeah.
Charlie, you were telling us before the broadcast too about a form of informal adoption that was also seemed to have some recognition of non-biological parent status.
Absolutely. The Hawaiian word for it is called hanai.
Hanai.
And it's an informal adoption. and would happen in a number of ways. Say a woman could not bear children. Maybe a sister or a friend of this woman who had a lot of kids would give one of the children to this woman to be raised. But there was always a recognition that who the biological mother was, but then there was always this Hanai mother that gave the nurturing and the raising. And you know, and there's also the idea that if a woman has children and for some reason can't take care of those kids, there's always somebody out there that will Hanai her kids.
Sounds almost like it takes a village.
Exactly.
Well, and of course, the wisdom that most communities have had about this has always gone in that direction. And it's always been interesting to me at how the law would ratify the nuclear family in this country against really the instincts of just about everybody. And the gay community, since we haven't been able to marry, and we've really chosen our families and selected our extended families and often been kicked out of our biological families and even chosen new parent surrogates and sibling surrogates, and we've really done that all along anyway. We have pretty interesting extended families, and the way in which we raise each other's children is that way as well. I mean, I know a number of lesbian couples raising children who've invited many of the men in their lives to be, tell me the word again?
Hanai.
Hanai, fathers.
Sure. Or honorary uncles, or
That's right,
but
exactly.
something to have many different kinds of relationship and many different kinds of support for the children.
That brings up an interesting point in some of the studies in the 1980s, looking again at lesbian parents versus heterosexual moms, that it was really clear that lesbian parents in multiple studies made a much greater effort to have a male role model, a male figure in their children's lives versus the heterosexual parents. That wasn't just in one study, but it was multiple studies. And going along with what you're saying is it recognizing the importance of the variety and diversity of exposures that kids had.
Well, and not only that, but there's so much less hostility. I mean,
I think
this is
that's
another blown
the
up
reason,
mythology. People say to me, now you lesbians, you really hate men, don't you? And I say, you know, the truth is I never met anybody who hated men more than straight women.
Absolutely.
Because they've had so much more to do with them and maybe had a bad experience, whereas we're just all, friends and we're fine.
And to go along with that, in children of families where there was a divorce, both again lesbian and heterosexual moms, the heterosexual moms had much greater anger and negative feelings about visitation with the children with the ex-husband than the lesbian moms did. It was really clear.
Although
again,
I've seen
in several
some
studies.
lesbian breakups.
No, but I'm talking about with the biologic father.
Yes, right.
Visitation with the biologic father.
Well, that's the other interesting issue, though, about this marriage thing, because in most heterosexual marriages where children are produced, you have two biological parents, and they are the people who entered into the marriage. We would be radically changing that, though we wouldn't be the first, because there are lots of different ways that people participate in childbearing and child raising, depending on their own circumstance. But we would typically not be the two biological parents of this child, and so we would always be in a place where we would have to be a step-parent who adopted the biological child of our partner, which is not the case with most heterosexual couples, because the law essentially opines that the biological parents are the legal parents, although with fathers you don't always know, so the law says it's the person who's married to this woman who has the child. So the interesting thing would be to see if the law over the course of the next century will change so that even the same gender person married to this biological mother would be considered the parent, and what gay men will do to be an assumed parent. I mean, the iterations are kind of endless and fun.
Well, it's fascinating that we really don't have one test of who the parent is. I mean, biology trumps sociology in some way. It doesn't matter who cares for the child, the biological tie may prevail in a custody dispute. But sometimes the legal status prevails over biology. I mean, in the statute that you're referring to, in California, the husband of a woman who gives birth is assumed to be the father, and even if the actual biological father comes along and says, no, no, it's me, right? Nobody has to listen to him.
That's
and
right.
he does not get to oust the legal father. Now, notice that there are two things going on there. There's a huge preference for the nuclear family, traditional nuclear family, and in some way there's a desire that, and there's a real need that there only be one father, or there only be one mother and one father. And, I think about one of the law review articles written in this area was, yes, this child does have two mothers. It's no surprise to us,
Well, and
but
of
it
course
seems to be very surprising to the law.
We're coming down to actually the last 30 seconds of the show, and I think that it's intriguing. I feel like we're sort of on the edge of a new way of thinking of family and the creation of family and even parenting. I mean, the truth is, if the state really cared about children, it would allow as many people as possible to sign a contract to be this child's parent and take responsibility and nurture and, and really enter into it. Well, I thank you all very, very much for sort of opening up this discussion. We've talked a lot about the law in Hawaii in other shows and lots of other spaces, but I think bringing these other perspectives in have been very helpful. I hope it's also been interesting to you, as we hope all the shows are. Thank you very much for participating. Thank you very much for being here. And it looks like if the Hawaii Supreme Court says yes to it, the world just might have to get used to it.